What's America's role in Israel's war with Iran? Just asking questions. U.S. forces aren't directly involved in the war with Iran yet, but those of us who remember the 2003 Iraq invasion can't help but be struck by some of the unsettling similarities. A terrorist attack setting into motion a chain of events culminating in a strike on a sovereign country about a year and a half later. Sensational but so far unverified claims of weapons of mass destruction eminently falling into the wrong hands, the allure of a swift and decisive victory over a cruel and corrupt regime. Of course, there are hugely important differences between then and now, but I wanted to bring on a guest with the long view, someone who understands firsthand how military intelligence is used and abused to justify war. Paul Pillar was a CIA analyst for 28 years, serving as the executive assistant to the CIA director from 1989 to 1991 amidst the Gulf War, and later rising to become the chief analyst and deputy director of the agency's counterterrorism center. Today, he's a non resident senior fellow at Georgetown Center for Security Studies and a non resident senior fellow at the Quincy Institute for Responsible Statecraft. Paul, thank you very much for joining me today.
It's good to be with you, Zach. Thank you.
So, the situation has been moving very quickly. And I want to start by making sure that you, the audience, and myself have a shared understanding of what we do and don't know right now, because I think you can kind of get buried beneath the cavalcade of information and kind of lose sight of what exactly happened. So, first, I'd just like to rewind us back to last Thursday night, June 12th, when Israel first struck Iran, and ask the question, how involved was our government? I mean, Trump was in the middle of publicly negotiating a new nuclear deal with Iran and making statements that day that saying he didn't want Israel to strike. I've got one of those right here. Um, I don't want them going in because I think it would blow it, said Trump when asked at a press conference about his discussions with Netanyahu. Might help it actually, but it could also blow it. So Trump's usual ambiguity there. Um, Secretary of State Marco Rubio, after the strike, issued this statement. This was the first official statement put out. Tonight, Israel took unilateral action against Iran. We are not involved in strikes against Iran. Um, and Trump echoed that on Truth Social. He said the U.S. had nothing to do with the attack on Iran tonight, and if U.S. forces are attacked in any way, shape, or form, there's going to be bloody conflict, and all hell is going to come down on you. Now, subsequent reporting from the New York Times said that Trump was briefed on the likely Israeli attack the Sunday before and told Israel he was ready to act alone. And Trump might have just been playing along to preserve some element of surprise. So, all that set up to ask, how much say do you think Trump had in how this all played out?
I would summarize it by saying there probably was not an explicit green light, but there was certainly no red light that the Trump administration flashed. I
Hmm.
think it's pretty certain that there was advanced knowledge, and even if there weren't the kind of explicit one-on-one briefings that the Israelis may have given the Trump administration, the signs were all there. I mean, much of that was getting reported in the press, which included the evacuations of a lot of American dependents from installations in the Middle East. That ought to have triggered lots of assumptions that an Israeli attack was probably imminent. The press reporting that you just reviewed, Zach, shows how rapidly Mr. Trump's own line on this has evolved from that first statement by Rubio that was very austere and just saying we don't have anything to do with it. And since then, the president has become nothing less than a cheerleader for what the Israelis have done. Even lapsing into the first person plural pronoun we when he talked about, we have achieved air superiority over Iran, even though it's the Israeli forces who have been doing it. I think it's still an open question to what extent there might have been, more cooperation besides not flashing a red light when it comes to things like intelligence sharing, possibly some logistic support. I think maybe these are things we'll find out about in the future. And finally, you can't disregard the fact that the United States has been by far, the biggest supplier and paymaster for the Israeli military for years and years. So it's a lot of U.S. made and U.S. paid for ordnance and equipment that has been used by the Israelis to conduct this attack. Uh, so yes, falls short of, so far at least, the United States taking direct part in offensive kinetic operations. But short of that, it's been um pretty much the way the president now phrases it, which is, we're very much in Israel's camp on this.
Yeah. So to that last point about the amount of aid that the U.S. Military aid specifically that the U.S. has supplied to Israel for decades, that is the obviously concerning part about it from a U.S. perspective because Israel, is a sovereign country that has its own interests and is free to pursue those interests. But we can't deny the fact that there's this, we're inextricably tied up with them. Here's a slide I pulled of total. This is from the latest 2023 congressional report on this. The total U.S. foreign aid obligations to Israel from 1946 to 2023. The total military aid
Right.
that I have highlighted there over that time period is 114 billion, 158 billion combined. At the bottom here, they say that total aid to Israel obligated over that time period is an estimated 260 billion. Um, so, given that relationship, what is the responsibility of the U.S. In this entire conflict? Given that Israel is making its own decisions and leading the way, how much say should the U.S. have in this situation?
Well, given those hundreds of billions, I mean, my answer would be the U.S. ought to have lots of say. And I would add, this is certainly the way foreign governments and populations see it. I mean, they're well aware of the magnitude of this aid relationship. And there is no hesitation in ascribing responsibility to the United States for whatever Israel does, even if the U.S. Secretary of State says, well, we weren't involved in this particular attack. So I think from a diplomatic point of view, as well as a political point of view, and as well as a moral point of view, the short answer to your question, Zach, is that the United States ought to assume a lot of responsibility. Now, what this reflects, of course, is a lot of potential leverage that the United States has not used, and it's not just the Trump administration. This has been the story through multiple administrations of both parties.
Hmm.
And with regard to, for example, what's everything that's been going on in the Gaza Strip for the last 20 months, this extends back through the Biden administration, which really was handling this with a kind of kid gloves approach, and certainly was not using the available leverage to try to reduce the extent of that tragedy. And now the Trump administration obviously is not using it either. So yes, plenty of responsibility, plenty of leverage, but simply not used.
And shortly after the strike, you published an article in Responsible Statecraft, headlined "Trump Must Condemn Israeli Acts of Illegal Naked Aggression." Um, that obviously didn't happen. He's now calling for unconditional surrender, as you mentioned, using the
Mhm.
plural we. We are doing the strike, sending U.S. reinforcements. But why, in your view, is it in America's national interests why was it in our national interest to kind of condemn and distance U.S. foreign policy from what happened?
The United States will be more secure and more prosperous in an international order in which wars of aggression are not waged. And to accept that uh, offensive, aggressive wars are to make them acceptable has all kinds of further implications with regard to what other countries do, with what other states do. I mean, we saw a little bit of this when we committed our own aggression against Iraq in 2003, which we referred back to. And the likes of Vladimir Putin in Russia made tremendous propaganda hay out of it, and not just propaganda, but seeing this as a justification and a basis for him to commit his own acts of aggression against Ukraine or someone else. The same could be said about China as it eyes Taiwan, and we can think of many other instances as well. So certainly, from a standpoint of why does it make sense to observe international law, including the United Nations Charter, which prohibits this kind of aggressive war. There are multiple ways in which the United States it would suffer and its interest would suffer if that set of norms breaks down entirely. And for the United States to support rather than condemn an instance of that is in clear violation of those norms uh, takes us that much closer to a breakdown. That's the main way I would phrase it, and then on top of that are all the other ways in which, the United States loses some of its soft power and shares in the opprobrium, that people would be directing against the likes of Israel when something like this happens. We've already seen a lot of this, in terms of what the United States has not done vis-a-vis the Gaza tragedy. Other governments being less willing to deal with our government, the United States suffering in the eyes of not just governments but populations worldwide, and this comes up in opinion polls. A lack of trust, a lack of respect, all those are ways in which U.S. interest will suffer uh, in multiple dimensions.
The rationale that we're hearing for both the strike and also why it's in the U.S. interest to support this strike is that Iran was about to obtain a nuclear weapon. There's considerable debate about that. Less than 3 months ago, the director of national intelligence, Tulsi Gabbard, had something else to say about that. We have that clip. Let's roll the Tulsi Gabbard clip.
The IC continues to assess that Iran is not building a nuclear weapon, and Supreme Leader Khamenei has not authorized the nuclear weapons program that he suspended in 2003. The IC continues to monitor closely if Tehran decides to reauthorize its nuclear weapons program. In the past year, we've seen an erosion of a decades-long taboo in Iran on discussing nuclear weapons in public, likely emboldening nuclear weapons advocates within Iran's decision-making apparatus. Iran's enriched uranium stockpile is at its highest levels and is unprecedented for a state without nuclear weapons.
So a little bit of a, ambiguous message there, starting the statement saying Iran is not actively pursuing a nuclear weapon. However, they are stockpiling more uranium than they have in the past, and things are looking concerning. And so Tulsi Gabbard has since, because Trump later said, I don't care what she says about this, and then she issued a statement saying there's not distance between us in terms of how we evaluate this. Um, I guess because presumably she did say that they're openly talking about it, even if not actively pursuing it. And then the CENTCOM commander had made a statement 2 days before the attack saying, should the regime decide to sprint to a nuclear weapon, it's estimated that current stockpiles and the available centrifuges across several enrichment plants are sufficient to produce the first 25 kilograms of weapon grade material in roughly 1 week and enough for up to 10 nuclear weapons in 3 weeks. Um, so lots of conflicting timelines out there, which is something you know quite a bit about as an Intel analyst. who criticized how intelligence was used about WMDs in the lead up to the Iraq War. What do you think the public should keep in mind when evaluating some very scary sounding claims about nuclear weapons imminently being obtained?
The main thing the public should keep in mind is that no matter how scary the prospect of a nuclear weapon in Iranian hands may be, you don't need a war to preclude it. We
Mm.
really need to recall the diplomatic history here. We had a laboriously negotiated agreement called the Joint Comprehensive Plan of Action, or JCPOA, which was concluded during the Obama administration in 2015 after a long, difficult negotiation. This is a very detailed document, goes on for like 150 pages, lots of detail. In it, through various restrictions, not only on uranium enrichment, but also what nuclear reactors in Iran could do and other aspects of their nuclear program, it basically closed all the possible pathways to an Iranian nuclear weapon. It limited Iran to very low enrichment, 3 point something percent. It provided for nuclear reactors being, filled in with cement and then other enriched fuel shipped out, to the likes of Russia, so it wouldn't have it anymore. And all of this confirmed by the most intrusive international inspection arrangement that had ever been voluntarily negotiated by any government, with IAEA, International Atomic Energy Agency inspectors being all over the program. The Iranians, by every confirmation and inspection by the IAEA, abided scrupulously by those limits over the next 3 years. Actually, for the next 4 years, even for a year after Donald Trump in his first term totally reneged on the U.S. Commitments under the JCPOA, renounced the agreement in May of 2018. The Iranians waited for about another year, hoping that the U.S. administration would come to its senses before it then began expanding beyond the JCPOA limits its uranium enrichment. And it's continued to expand it in subsequent years, which produced the kinds of numbers that you put on the screen about enriched uranium, which so far has come up to the 60% level, which is just a level beyond the 90% or so that it would need to be further enriched for weapons grade. There is still, as we saw in the clip from Tulsi Gabbard, in terms of the intelligence judgment, no indication that as yet the Iranians have returned to trying to fashion any of this into a nuclear weapon. And even if they did, they'd probably be about a year or so away from actually having a deliverable weapon. But the main point, the basic point for the public to bear in mind is diplomacy was sufficient to close all possible paths to an Iranian nuclear weapon. You don't
Mm.
need a war. And this was
And
all thrown away by Trump in 2018. And the Israelis, if they really were interested solely and primarily on preventing an Iranian nuke, they should have applauded the agreement that was reached in 2015 rather than trying to undermine it and to applaud instead Trump's reneging on it.
here's kind of the effects of the Iran nuclear deal visualized by the Institute for Science and International Security. Between those two red lines, you can see the the number of newly installed advanced nuclear centrifuges is very low, and then after withdrawal from the deal you start to see that increase. By the way, as always, we link all our sources in the description so you can go look at this material yourself. um, you know why would do you have any insight as to why both I can ask you two questions about Trump withdrawing from that deal, and then Israel being non-supportive of a deal that seemed, by all accounts, to be keeping Iranian nuclear enrichment at a fairly low level. Why did this fall apart?
It mainly gets back to partisanship in U.S. foreign policy, which is the subject of a book I wrote about a year and a half ago. Um, for Donald Trump, this was something that Barack Obama did, so Trump's automatic reaction was, I need to oppose it. Indeed, by most observers' accounts, the JCPOA could probably count as Mr. Obama's biggest, most significant foreign policy achievement during his presidency, and I think I would agree with that. So the partisan reaction to that, which is not just Donald Trump, but basically the Republican Party as a whole, if you look at what they did at the time the JCPOA was signed, and then later when uh, President Biden made some tentative moves toward trying to revive it, uh, lockstep opposition, because this was seen as a democratic accomplishment, so we have to oppose it. That it unfortunately, it's almost
Hmm.
as simple as that. Um, and I think that that's consistent with a lot of other things that Mr. Trump has done in other areas like trade and economic policy. If there was something that came up under a Democratic administration, like a trade agreement, like NAFTA or the Trans-Pacific Partnership, then the reaction was, got to oppose it. Even if, like in the case of NAFTA, he replaced it with another agreement, which was a slight change for NAFTA. Uh, but he can pronounce it to be one of the best deals ever, whereas NAFTA he called one of the worst deals ever. This is simply another instance of that, and another unfortunate way in which how partisanship has intruded so extensively into U.S. foreign policy, it has hurt U.S. interests.
And what about the Israel side of the equation? Why would Israel be non-supportive or unsupportive of a deal where this, international inspections agency gets access to their weapons program and gives them greater assurance that Iran does not become a nuclear threat, presumably?
Well, as I said, if the main Israeli motivation was simply the one centering on nuclear weapons, then they should have applauded the JCPOA and supported it. But that is not the main. It's not certainly not the sole, and I think it's not even the main driver of Israeli policy when it comes to Iran and when it comes to the current conflict. A centerpiece of Israeli policy, certainly for many years, but at least as strong under Mr. Netanyahu as it's ever been before, is for Iran to serve the purpose of a bête noire, uh, an object that can be loathed and isolated, and can be blamed for all of the ills in the Middle East, whether they're really responsible for them or not, and can be a master distraction of international attention away from anything that Israel itself is doing, such as what's going on in the Gaza Strip. I think that more than anything else has driven Israeli policy. Uh, the Israeli objective, even more strongly than anything having to do with weapons, has been to oppose any sort of diplomacy with Iran by anyone on anything, uh, but rather to try to keep the Islamic Republic as isolated and as weak and as hated internationally as possible. So that's why they would oppose not only the JCPOA, but anything else in the economic, political, or military area that involves coming to terms with or having peaceful diplomacy with Iran.
Yeah, I mean, people have been pointing out that that Israel has been Netanyahu has been warning about the imminence of Iranian nuclear weapons for decades, and I pulled one example of that, which was him testifying before the UN. Let's see, this was in the UN
Right.
General Assembly in 2012, calling for a red line
Right.
on nuclear on nuclear material enrichment. Um, let's roll that clip because I want to ask you a question about this.
By next spring, at most by next summer, at current enrichment rates, they will have finished the medium enrichment and move on to the final stage. From there, it's only a few months, possibly a few weeks, before they get enough enriched uranium for the first bomb. If these are the facts, and they are, where should a red line be drawn? A red line should be drawn right here. Before Iran completes the second stage of nuclear enrichment necessary to make a bomb.
Okay, so no immediate action was taken after that speech, and Iran did not obviously achieve a nuclear weapon within months of that speech. Um, is this an example of what you're talking about in terms of kind of using the threat of this to achieve some other objective?
Yeah, it is an example of it. It's probably the most colorful example with his cartoon bomb. But it's interesting, this was, as you mentioned, 2012. It was when the negotiations that would eventually lead to the JCPOA in 2015 were just getting underway. And the point is that agreement, the Joint Comprehensive Plan of Action, drained Mr. Netanyahu's bomb. It made the red line not only up where he was drawing it, but way down below.
Yeah.
At the level of low
Huh.
enrichment and very limited quantities. So even if you take
Well,
everything,
did that
including
speak?
his
But
graphic aid,
let me ask you.
totally to heart.
Yeah, well, just to make sure that I'm not missing something, did that speech actually spur this create momentum for the Iran deal? So, in a sense, was it a good thing to go up there and very colorfully draw a red line and say, like, we need to do something about this? Did that kind of motivate the Iran deal into reality?
Well, yes, as my friend Trita Parsi has written about this at length, the concern in the Obama administration about the Netanyahu government possibly doing exactly what they've done now within the past week, that is to say, a military attack on Iran. That was one of the motivations for the Obama administration to place high priority in trying to reach this negotiated agreement. So yes, it was a spur in that instance. Obviously, not a spur in the direction that Mr. Netanyahu wanted. He did not want a negotiated deal with Iran for the reasons I mentioned before. Um, but I love that prop, the cartoon bomb, because you can take it and draw another line in terms of what the negotiated agreement did, and it was far, far better than what Netanyahu himself was talking about.
Hmm.
In terms of
Now
examples
Trump.
of my earlier point about the priority that Israel has given in its foreign policy to trying to isolate Iran and get everyone to keep hating it. I did a piece sometime back that just looked at a couple of the other speeches to the UN General Assembly, part of the general debate that occurs every September. And I can't remember which year this was, but it was during the time when Netanyahu was out of power and Naftali Bennett was the Israeli prime minister. And I just looked at the speeches that were given to the UN General Assembly general debate by Mr. Bennett on behalf of Israel and by the president of Iran. And what did they have to say about each other's country? Well, in the case of the Iranian speaker, he just had one short paragraph of about uh, two or three sentences about Israel that was just mentioned in the course of, we need to do something for the Palestinians. That was it. Mr. Bennett's speech went on. It was like about a third of the speech was all about Iran and how awful Iran is, how bad it is, how bad it is, how bad it is. He just went on and on and on. I think that shows you where the priorities of each of those governments have been with regard to Israeli-Iranian relations.
Speaking of Naftali Bennett, I have a clip of him because I think he lays out in this clip, he lays out the case for why Iran really is a global threat. He calls them the octopus that is really controlling. They've got all these proxies surrounding Israel, and if they are the real problem, if they can be taken care of, then it solves a lot. I want to play that clip because I think it represents a certain point of view that is now sort of playing out. Could you roll that, John?
About a decade ago, I came up with a strategy against Iran, and I called it the octopus, terror octopus or octopus strategy. The first thing was to understand what's going on, and then you can build a strategy. What's going on in the Middle East is about 70% of the problems in the entire Middle East stem from the Islamic Republic of Iran. I would view it's a very radical regime, by the way, also incompetent and corrupt, a bit similar to the Soviet Union of the 80s. But what it does, it exports its ideology and terror with its arms all across the Middle East. Every country it touches, it ultimately destroys. It's like the anti-Midas touch. Mm-hmm. Look at Lebanon, look at Syria, look at Iraq. It's like Yemen. So in all these places, it builds a local proxy, sometimes based on Shiites that live there, but not always. For example, Hamas is a Sunni organization. It empowers them, it funds them, it provides them weapons, it trains them, and ultimately it also commands them to generate terror. Not only against Israel generally, but also against Israel. Now, I'll say straight at this point, we need to topple the Iranian regime. That's what we need to do, and it will fall.
So what he's laying out there is he says Iran is responsible for about 70% of the problems in the region. They are sort of the puppet masters of all these people all these groups that are attacking Israel. And if you build on that, this was the moment that Israel had the opportunity to finally do something about it. The regime is weak. They are, possibly racing towards a nuclear weapon. We've, weakened their proxies. So this is just the perfect time to do this. And it's going to be good for the region and good for the world to take out this, uniquely threatening actor in the region. What do you think of that analysis?
Well, Ben, that 70% is actually more modest. The way Netanyahu and others talk, it's more often like 100% is the accusation. To suggest that Iran is responsible for all these bad things going on in Gaza and in Yemen and Syria and Lebanon just totally ignores the roots of the problems that we've seen. I mean, let's focus on Gaza and the Palestinian territory, since we've had that horrible story going on for now over a year and a half. Yes, Hamas has received some U.S. aid. It is in no way whatsoever a proxy of Iran in the sense of taking orders or doing things on Iran's behest. There's no indication, for example, that the Hamas attack on October 7th of 2023 had anything to do with Iran or was directed by Iran. Likewise, the Houthis in Yemen, the same sort of story. You had a long-standing civil war there that was based on grievances among the tribes in the northern part of the country, principally the Houthis, that felt aggrieved over how they were treated by the regime in Sana'a. The Saudis and the Emiratis, took the other side, and to the extent that the Iranians got involved in giving any aid to the Houthis, that they just saw it as an opportunity to bleed the Saudis when they saw that in their interest. When the Houthis did perhaps their most significant act of that whole war, which was to capture the capital city of Sana'a, reports indicate they did so against the advice of the Iranians. And now most recently, of course, with the things like the Houthi attacks on the shipping, this was all a direct result, as the Houthis had made abundantly clear of what's going on in Gaza and the suffering that the Palestinians have undertaken. When you had a brief ceasefire up there, the Houthis stopped their attacks on the shipping. Iran has had nothing to do with that. In Lebanon, everything that happened there going back to the 1980s and the rise of Hezbollah had to do with an earlier Israeli attack on and occupation of Lebanon. Hezbollah rose because it was able to present itself as a defender of Lebanese freedom and Lebanese sovereignty against the Israeli invader. It wasn't something that the Iranians cooked up that to cause all kinds of turmoil in Lebanon. I could go on and on and on, but it's simply a misnomer and basically Israeli propaganda to attribute all these ills in the region of a very unstable region to this one source, when in fact, for the most part, the Iranians have been reacting to things that the Israelis have done, to things that the Saudis have done, to things that the Iraqis have done. I mean, take, for example, the considerable efforts by Iran to cultivate influence among militias and other groups in Iraq. There's no doubt about that. It gets commented on quite frequently. Well, the background of that is the horrible 8-year war that was started by Saddam Hussein in 1980, and in which Iranians, as well as Iraqis, suffered grievously. The Iranians, suffered casualties in the hundreds of thousands. And so from the standpoint of anyone in Tehran, not just the Islamic Republic, but Iranians in general, they want to make absolutely sure that even if Iraq isn't really an ally, they don't want to have any regime in Baghdad that's going to do anything like what Saddam Hussein did in 1980 again.
Mhm.
That's a much more accurate picture of what's going on in the Middle East and the sources of all these turmoil. It's not there's one head of the octopus that's causing all 70% of these problems. That's simply propaganda.
So you're saying there that Israel's response to the October 7th attack and their subsequent actions in Gaza have really that's inflamed a lot of these other actors, not they're not being directed per se from Tehran. They have their own reasons for being angry about the situation and striking against Israel. And then obviously there's been lots of back and forth missiles lobbed. You know, when we zoom in on the Gaza tragedy for a moment, what would have, in your mind, what would have been the right way for Israel to respond to that to avoid this wider conflict breaking out?
Well, in terms of immediate response, they certainly had Hamas-related targets they could go after militarily, and I think most of the world would approve and applaud of doing exactly that after what was really a horrible attack that Hamas committed against Israeli civilians in October 2023. But obviously, what we've seen since then has been an overall assault on the entire Palestinian population of the Gaza Strip, with deaths now in the tens of thousands. Something like 55,000 has been the most recent official figure I saw, and the likely real figure is far higher than that because you've got bodies still in the rubble. And that's not even to mention the starvation and so on, everything else that's going on. By the way, I mean, this gets back to the assault on Iran, Zach, because I mentioned one of the motivations of the constant anti-Iran rhetoric and policy of Israel is to distract the attention of the entire world from what Israel is doing, especially to the Palestinians. And I think a reflection of that is that some of the most egregious instances of Palestinians who are lining up at these new restricted aid centers trying to get a bit of food aid, and we've got near famine conditions now in Gaza, have been just gunned down by the IDF. There was an incident just the other day in which something like 70 casualties. That was already happening before, but a couple of the worst instances have happened just within the past 6 days since the world's attention has been seized by the war going on in Iran. So I think that's evidence for my assertion about how the Israelis see the distracting view of this. But there's a much broader answer to your question, Zach. It's not just how Israel could have immediately responded, but history did not start in that conflict on October 7th, 2023. You've got an entire history of subjugation of the Palestinian population, most notably in Gaza, which became an open air prison, but in all sorts of ways with regard to the residents of the West Bank and East Jerusalem as well. And what should or could Israel have done? Well, they could have or should have done lots of things much earlier to try not to frustrate the aspirations for self-determination by the whole Palestinian nation, and to go back to the UN General Assembly's partition plan of 1947, which is the closest thing that we have to a birth certificate for the state of Israel. But we should note that resolution and that plan provided for two states. One was what became the state of Israel, the Jewish state, and the other was supposed to be an Arab state, and that was never achieved. Um, I don't want to replay the whole history of the last
Yeah,
75 plus years, but there are many things that the state of Israel could have done to bring that about.
yeah,
And had it
and
been
yeah, I
brought
want to
about, we never would have
avoid
had any
getting
of this history we've seen on this side.
Yeah, I want to avoid getting too far into the history of Israel Palestine because that's a whole, you could do hours and hours talking
Yeah,
about that.
huge subject,
I
yeah.
want us to I want to refocus on the the role that the U.S. plays here, specifically in what's unfolded with Iran. And one thing that y- you know Trump has maintained that his interest here is stopping Iran from getting a nuclear weapon, and that he's now he has pointed out that the negotiations broke down in early June because Iran, rejected his deal. Iran could have taken a deal on June 2nd, and none of this would have happened. Does he have a point? Like, why didn't Iran take that deal?
The key issue has been the demand on the US side for zero enrichment of uranium. One of the things that the whole earlier history, under first the George W. Bush administration and then the Obama administration and the whole diplomatic history leading up to the JCPOA in 2015 demonstrated is that as long as the US side insists on no enrichment, we're not going to have an agreement. That simply is a red line, always has been for Iran. And as the
Mm.
JCPOA demonstrated, which I discussed earlier, you don't need zero enrichment to close all pathways to a possible Iranian nuclear weapon. It simply is not necessary. So Mr. Trump does have a chance to repair some of that damage of what he did in 2018. He has, and I believe him in this respect. He genuinely wants an agreement. He would tout that as an achievement. I think he can find ways to honestly tout it as having been better in some respects than the agreement that Obama achieved. Of course, that's what he wants to say, and I think there are conceivable agreements that can be reached and that Iran would sign, where Mr. Trump could make that claim. For example, an agreement that went somewhat farther than the JCPOA did in insisting on Iranian observance, signing up to and observing the so-called additional protocol of the International Atomic Energy Agency, which provides for even more freedom for the inspectors to look at different things, going above and beyond anything that might be in the explicitly in a new U.S.-Iranian agreement. I think the Iranians would sign on to that, and we'd have an agreement, and Mr. Trump could rightly say he had a significant foreign policy achievement, and it went beyond what Obama did in an important respect. That's
Yeah, a
that's
lot
what we're
of
facing. But as long as we say zero enrichment, we're not going to have an agreement.
a lot of us, including myself, are wondering whether that is actually what Trump wants, if he wants a deal. I think you're making a strong case that Israel never wanted such a deal to happen. We just saw a clip of the former prime minister saying regime change is really the only option for Israel. Netanyahu himself has not said that. He was asked about regime change by Bret Baier on Fox News earlier this week. I want to play that clip to ask you to, because I have a question about regime change. Can we roll that, please, John?
So is regime change part of the effort here?
Could certainly be the result because the Iran regime is very weak. I think it's basically left with two things. It's plans to have atomic bombs and ballistic missiles. That's basically what Iran has. They certainly don't have the people. 80% of the people would throw these theological thugs out. I mean, they murder them, they oppress them for 46 years. They've yearned for freedom. I mean, they shoot women because their hair is uncovered. They shoot students. They just suck the oxygen from this brave and gifted people, the Iranian people. And you know, the Persian people and the Jewish people have had an ancient friendship. Goes back to the times of Cyrus the Great. It could happen again. But again, the decision to act, to rise up at this time is the decision of the Iranian people. We decided to act because we saw enough uranium, enriched uranium, for 9 bombs. And all they had to do was weaponize them.
So, he's steadfast there that regime change is not the reason for this strike, that it's about the uranium enrichment, but mentioning at the beginning of the answer that there's lots of reasons why Iranians would want a regime change. What did you make of that answer?
Well, if you just look at the Israeli target list, which now has gone far, far beyond anything associated with nuclear facilities, or even beyond just military targets in general, we've had hundreds of civilian casualties reported so far. Yes, I think stirring things up politically has been inside Iran is another Israeli objective. Now, as to exactly what the Netanyahu government would like to see coming out of that, well, that's a different question. Um, my guess
Mhm.
is that they would be satisfied with something kind of like where Libya is now, where ever since Gaddafi was overthrown, it's been a chaotic mess, um, with not even a single stable government to this day having taken root. Uh, I
Serious.
doubt very much, and I remember seeing one statement by an Israeli official in a moment of candor about this some years ago. I think the last thing that Netanyahu would want is the emergence in Iran of a stable, moderate democracy with friendly relations with the United States. It doesn't want that at all because that would mean overthrowing what has been a centerpiece of Israeli foreign policy, and that's the whole theme of Iran being a bête noire that is responsible, in Bennett's terms, for 70% of all the ills in the Middle East, and has this great distracting power. So we're not paying so much attention to what's going on in a place like Gaza. Uh, and of course, with the tremendous special relationship that Israel enjoys with the United States, Netanyahu has no desire to see friendly relations between Iran and the United States.
Well, the hope that people always have, and I understand that there's very good reason to be skeptical of this, given how regime change has gone in many Middle Eastern countries over the past couple decades. But the hope is that a somewhat liberal, stable democracy would emerge in the wake of the theocracy, the oppressive theocracy that's currently running Iran. And I guess, like, the reason people have hope in Iran is that there have been some indications that there's a desire for that among the young people. There have been these uprisings, both in during the Green Revolution and then also during just recently. There's been instability within the regime, and Iran actually, unlike many of these other countries, was once upon a time kind of one of those liberal democracies. Um, is it is there a case that Iran actually is different, and maybe there is hope that there could be something like a regime that Israel and the US and Europe could be comfortable with there?
Well, I think the immediate let's stick with the immediate issue, which is, what is the effect of the war that's going on now and how this relates to regime change? There's no question there's a lot of discontent with the regime in Iran. There's been a lot of economic mismanagement, which, in addition to the sanctions that the U.S. has imposed, has caused a lot of suffering, among the population. No doubt about that. But I think we've seen, and the opposition voices I've seen reporting over the last several days from inside Iran, the main theme that emerges is that those opposition voices have been making a clear distinction between the regime and the Iranian nation. And we've had a lot of the usual rallying around the flag effect, in which people who are very unhappy about the regime and the economic and other situations that are involved in Iran. But they say, right now our nation is under attack, and we're all Iranians. Um,
Mm.
so to suggest that the war is moving politics in Iran in a direction that you mentioned, I think is simply we're not seeing it. So we're not seeing it, number one, because of that rally around the flag effect. But secondly, if, and this might be the case, even after some dust from the current combat has settled, if we were to see enough of a political change in Iran in the short term, where we could start talking about regime change, I think it's at least as likely that it would be change in the direction of a harder line, more intractable sort that neither we nor anybody else in the Western world would be at all comfortable with. I would think the most likely alternative possibility would be some, military type dictatorship, perhaps led by some of the Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps officers who have moved up as Israel has killed some of their previous superiors, and would be arguing that the previous governments, including perhaps the supreme leader himself, Khamenei, but the likes of the current president Pezeshkian, have been too soft, and uh, and this particularly gets to the nuclear weapons issue. I think some of
Mm.
those hardliners, their voices are being strengthened, the ones who are arguing that Iran should try to build a nuclear deterrent, because this kind of attack that's going on shows that we need more of a deterrent than we have now. Firing a few missiles, conventional missiles at Israel, isn't going to be enough of a deterrent. So, yeah, we might have some political change, but I don't think it's something that you and I in the West are going to be happy with if it does occur.
How how does that sort of positive regime change typically happen? Clearly, happening in the wake of a devastating war has not been there's not a strong track record of that, at least in recent history. But I just hate to be fatalistic about the idea that there's this latent desire for a more liberal government in Iran, yet they're stuck under this theocratic dictatorship. How would an actual, like, positive, sustainable regime change happen in a place like Iran?
Well, usually it happens, without the foreign instigation. It happens when you've had, with the passage of time, uh, the effect of resentment of whoever is the incumbent, building to such a point that the people themselves are able to take things into their own hands, and perhaps there's just enough rot and fatigue inside the regime itself, that change becomes possible. I'm thinking of things like movements from military regimes to democracies in Latin America countries in the 1980s,
Right.
that's 80s and 90s, that sort of thing. Uh, but as soon as you get the outsiders involved, then not only do you get this rally around the flag fact, but you also are are discrediting some of the same people that you would most like to support because they become associated with foreign intervention. And, in addition to the miserable record that the U.S. has had in trying to instigate or support regime change in the Middle East, which certainly includes Iraq starting in 2003 and Libya when Gaddafi was overthrown. I mean, we can add Iran itself with the U.S. instigated coup in 1953, overthrowing a sort of leftist, and so we didn't like him, a guy named Mossadegh, but popularly elected prime minister. That left Iran in the hands of a monarch, Shah Reza Pahlavi, who ultimately turned out to have a rule that was weak as well as harsh, and that led directly to the Iranian Revolution of 1979, which produced the Islamic Republic that we have today. So there are multiple ways in which foreign interference in trying to instigate regime change can backfire, even if the backfiring may take several decades.
Yeah, and I mean that operation was to my understanding, was a joint operation between the British intelligence and
With the numbers.
U.S. intelligence. Was kind of the beginning in a lot of ways of what we call covert operations, and it's just wild that like now it's like how many decades later we're seeing that culminate in this. Like, will there ever
Yeah.
be a rethink or a recognition that these things can backfire?
Well, I think so, and it's interesting, going back to the immediate issue, and, as you and I speak, today, Mr. Trump does not seem to have yet made a decision about whether the United States is gonna
Yeah.
directly intervene in the Israeli war on Iran. Perhaps as people view this podcast, that decision will have already been made one way or another. Uh, but one thing that's been noted frequently by observers is how within Mr. Trump's own core political constituency, the MAGA movement, there is a
Yeah.
lot of division here. And there are people like Tucker Carlson and Steve Bannon and Marjorie Taylor Greene, who have been speaking out rather strongly against the U.S. joining this war. Now, there maybe you can attribute various motives to the people involved, but I think part of it is exactly what you're talking about, Zach, realization of how, past interference, like the Iraq War, hasn't worked out very well. And so you've got people, in this case, of the MAGA on the right stripe, saying some of the same things that you hear some people, restrainers on the left saying, that this is just not the way to go. And we'll see how, Mr. Trump right now, at this moment, has conflicting pressures on him. People like Tucker Carlson are telling him one thing. People like Benjamin Netanyahu obviously are telling him something different. And we'll see how that comes out.
Yeah, there was a really interesting exchange yesterday that showcases that dissent or that division on the right. Tucker Carlson interviewed Ted Cruz about what's unfolding
All
in
right.
Iran. And Tucker Carlson has now been branded by Trump as kooky Tucker Carlson for his dissent. But I want to play just a little bit of that exchange. I think the entire conversation is worth viewing if you want to understand what's going on here within MAGA. But let's roll just that one clip.
Look, I like Trump. I campaigned for Trump. I know Trump. I talked to him last night. I'm not against Trump, and you know that.
But you're against his foreign policy.
I think that we should be very careful about entering into more foreign wars that don't help us when our country is dying.
When you say
and our
don't
country
help
is
us,
dying.
Look, yes, focus on our country. I'm all for it. But the naivete.
You don't even know how much money this costs.
Hey.
You don't know anything about the country whose government you want to overthrow, and you're calling me reckless.
I want to stop a lunatic who wants to murder us from getting nuclear weapons
Fair.
that could kill millions of Americans.
Fair.
You say, I can't see how that benefits America in any way. That is bizarre. And by the way,
bizarre.
isolationism, your foreign policy is the foreign policy of Jimmy Carter and Barack Obama.
Oh, absolutely.
And it doesn't work.
Yeah, I'm a big leftist. This is so silly. I'm Jimmy Carter and Barack Obama. Okay. let me just say one last thing.
So how is your foreign policy different from Jimmy Carter's? Seriously.
Please.
But I asked that question seriously.
I don't even know what you're talking about. Jimmy Carter?
So
What century is this? I am the product of the last 25 years, watching carefully, being involved in the periphery, and I see an unending string of foreign policy disasters that have impoverished and hurt our country.
unending string.
An unending string. They would include Afghanistan, Iraq, Libya, Syria, and our inability to stop the Houthis, by the way, in Yemen, which exposes us as weak, and I grieve over that. So these are failures. You helped preside over some of them as a member of the Senate.
Okay. What's so interesting to me about that clip is that Ted Cruz is so stuck in this paradigm of like, oh, your foreign policy is like Jimmy Carter's, like, and that kind of left-right divide, as you mentioned before, is sort of dissolving in a way, and there's a new alignment. How do you hope that alignment and the schism that's happening, like, what would be the best case scenario in terms of how that affects U.S. foreign policy going forward?
Well, Cruz's business about trying to tell Carlson, well, he's just like Obama or Jimmy Carter. That's the partisanship dimension that I discussed earlier, where
Right.
it's gotten to the point where Republicans considered, or at least some Republicans like Ted Cruz, consider Democrats at least as much of an enemy as any foreign enemies, be the Iranians or anyone else. And unfortunately, that's another part of it. I just might note, elsewhere in that interview, one of the zingers that Carlson got in was to ask Cruz, well, how many people are in Iran?
Yeah.
And Cruz didn't know. And so Carlson would say, you're proposing intervening in a country you don't even know how big they are. I mean, the answer is the approximate population of Iran is 92 million. It has an area that's more than 3 times as large as Iraq. So if you were certainly talking about anything about a ground invasion, this would be a huge, huge enterprise, orders of magnitude beyond what we've been talking about just with regard to air assaults. And it would be
Yeah, and by the
certainly
way,
the biggest U.S.
Cruz was
military operation since.
Yeah, and I mean, Cruz was acting as if that was some sort of gotcha question, when he is on the Foreign Affairs Committee for the Senate. He is one of the lead advocates of backing this to the max. I don't think it's out of bounds to ask, could you ballpark the population of this country that we might get involved with striking in the next week or so?
Yeah. Well, I'm not real big on zingers. I just wanted to note that. So
Yeah.
so that I could know what the population is and how big a country it is and how immense a task it would be if you're talking about any kind of operation that had a real chance of doing regime change. But I don't yeah, I'm drifting away from your earlier question, Zach, which was
Oh yeah,
how
I
do
mean,
we
you were mentioning that the partisanship has been really dangerous in terms of how U.S. foreign policy is formulated, and I just wanted to know, how do you hope that changes, like how can we better protect ourselves? Like, what is there just a different mindset that is needed in order to have like a truly rational and security producing foreign policy for the United States?
Well, I think the it starts with we're all Americans, number one. And number two, if we're talking
Mm.
about adversaries, we're talking about foreign adversaries. Ronald Reagan once admonished his aides who started saying some ill things about Democrats. And he said, remember, they're our political opponents. They're not our enemies. And yet, we're seeing rhetoric within his own party now in more recent years that speaks specifically of enemies. And you get lines like Ted Cruz saying, the ultimate insult is to say that you're doing something like a Democratic administration did. I think, Zach, you have to remember, again, we're all Americans, but then when discussing something like, what should we involve the United States in a military attack on Iran, you have to try to stay very narrowly focused on the specific issues without getting the party labels in the way at all. I heard somebody just yesterday who was someone who's on the left politically saying, geez, I never thought I would ever, forward a tweet by Marjorie Taylor Greene, but I did that because she said some sensible things about the need to stay out of the war in Iran. Uh, I, I
Yeah.
think, I would find it very difficult for me to imagine forwarding things that Marjorie Taylor Greene said, but on this particular issue, I would just sort of erase, other thing from my mind, other things that she had said on other issues, and the fact that she's a Republican on the MAGA right, and focus specifically on the issues at hand. And I think that's what Republicans and Democrats alike need to do.
Yeah, I mean, there's another really good example of that with Thomas Massey, Republican from Kentucky, and Ro Khanna, Democrat from
No
California,
problem.
are co-sponsoring this war powers resolution, which would, actually require Congress to weigh in on whether we go to war with Iran or not. Those are the types of that's the type of bipartisan. Sometimes bipartisanship is just like, we're both corrupt and kind of like captured by the same special interests, but this is the kind of bipartisanship that I like to see, where you're kind of bringing back, reasserting congressional authority in this extremely important domain of foreign policy. I want
Yes,
to
and
bring the
and on
yeah.
on the
Go ahead.
Senate side,
Sorry.
we might mention, the Senator Kaine, who's a Democrat, has a it's somewhat different, but a similar resolution, uh, insisting on, congressional, decision with regard to any, involvement in the war in Iran. And as we speak, my understanding is, he was so far just the sole sponsor. There are a bunch of Democrats who'd be eager to, sign on, but, Kaine first wants to get at least one Republican first as a co-sponsor, because if he had just a string of Democrats, that would tend to discourage any of the Republicans from signing on as well. So I think it's the right approach to try to get the second co-sponsor to be a Republican.
Yeah, I agree, and we're maybe paging someone like Rand Paul here, but I want to ask you about where things are headed vis-a-vis U.S. involvement in this. There's some disturbing signs, some ominous developments. Trump published this really what I found to be a really disturbing text message from Israel ambassador to Israel, Mike Huckabee, where he writes, "No president in my lifetime has been in a position like yours, not since Truman in 1945," which, to remind everyone, is
Yeah.
when atomic bombs were dropped in Japan.
Yeah.
I don't reach out to persuade you, only to encourage you. I believe you'll hear from heaven, and that voice is more important than mine or anyone else's. Um, the U.S., as we mentioned near the top, has deployed Air Force tankers for refueling, some Navy destroyers and carriers to the area. There's reports Israel wants the U.S. America's help in destroying the Fordo enrichment facility, which is a nuclear enrichment facility underneath a mountain and requires dropping like a 30,000-ton bomb that I guess America is much
No.
better positioned militarily to deliver. For Trump's side, he said, "I may do it, I may not do it. Nobody knows what I'm going to do." What are given where I guess the chess pieces are at the moment? What are your biggest concerns at this kind of perilous moment?
If I had to place an even money bet, I think Trump will finally decide to intervene. I hope sincerely I am wrong. But if we look at the direction of his rhetoric that has progressed from in the first hours of the attack, um, just the neutral statement from Rubio saying we're not involved, to now basically cheerleading for what the Israelis had done. I think, unfortunately, that's the way he's going. I still hope that enough of those MAGA voices in his own constituency, like Tucker Carlson and Steve Bannon, may incline him in the other direction. But that's not the way I would bet right now.
Best case scenario, what influence would you hope the U.S. would be exerting from this point forward?
The Trump administration has to convey messages to three audiences: the government of Israel, the government of Iran, and the American people. To Israel, the main message has to be the war has to stop. You can claim whatever sort of victory you want to claim in terms of destruction that's already been imposed on the Iranians and the weakening of their armed forces, damage to the nuclear program, but we do not see a wider war in the Middle East, including one involving the United States, as in our interest or in your interest. To the Iranian government, the message has to be the U.S. is still very much interested in reaching a negotiated agreement on nuclear matters. It is one that would allow some uranium enrichment, but would have to have other restrictions that in some respects would go beyond the JCPOA from 10 years ago, possibly including, for example, some kind of enrichment consortium that would involve the Gulf Arab countries and not just Iran. And to the American people, you really have to play it straight in terms of what the actual situation here is. Yes, the Iranians have enriched way beyond the earlier limits because we pulled out of the agreement, but they're not on the verge of a bomb. And by far, what would be most in U.S. interest is not to fight another Middle East war. Mr. Trump can say, I campaign partly on keeping us out of wars, so that's the way I'm going. But we need to use diplomacy to make sure there is not an Iranian nuclear weapon, but to do it peacefully without dragging the United States into another war. Those are the messages that I would hope the administration could convey.
And last question, which is what we ask all of our guests. What is a question that you think more people should be asking?
Well, I would hope the American people would ask themselves, what are the biggest sources of instability and of innocent people being killed or maimed in the Middle East or in any other region for that matter. And we can't dwell in cliches and just use the particular labels that we've habitually used. Iran, the biggest state sponsor of terrorism, things like that, but rather to look at what we read in the newspapers and what we see in the news about what actually is going on and who is doing it. We have to get past old labels and old stereotypes. And so the key question to ask is, what are all the sources of instability and death and destruction and disorder in the Middle East? It's not all one place. Look at in detail at where it is.
Paul Pillar, thank you for coming on the show.
Thanks for listening to Just Asking Questions. If you want to support the show and help it grow, please like and share this episode. Leave a comment letting us know what you think, and if you have questions you'd like us to answer or any suggestions, you can email us at justaskingquestions@reason.com. See you next time.